Hello, everyone. It is 5 past and we will start. There will probably be more people tuning in. On behalf of the Otter Youth Circle, I welcome everyone to our first webinar. We're very excited. And before we actually start, I would like to read out the webinar rules. You can see them also on the screen. Please keep your microphone on mute throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, type them in the chat and there will be a Q&A at the end of the webinar. Don't be shy, turn on your camera. We will also take some screenshots during the webinar. And please note that this webinar will be recorded and the video might be uploaded to our future YouTube channel. So first, we'd like to tell you something about us, the Otter Youth Circle. The Otter Youth Circle was founded last year in 2023 and currently consists of 4 active members and the OSG communication chair. And our main aims are to represent youth within the IUCN Otter Specialist Group and also to increase youth representation in otter research also on the long term. So in general, our goals are connection and communication. And according to our own action plan, we conducted a survey last year to learn more about youth needs and interests in the OSG. We just started our webinar series as planned this year. And further, we want to work a little bit on social media representation of youth and offer support during OSG conferences and meetings. So now we also would like to learn more about you. Therefore, we prepared a little Slido. I will just click through the Slido and you may scan the QR code and answer the questions. I will wait a bit with each slide so that you have enough time to answer the questions. So first, we'd like to know, obviously, from which country you are tuning in.
Yes, it does say voting closed, which some people are also commenting in the comments.
Okay. Give us a second.
Yeah, just give us a second. We're working on the technical issues. Well, this is the first webinar. But I'm sure that we'll be able to do the slider soon.
Okay.
Okay, it should be working now. So
there we go.
Please join us.
Yay! There we go. So many people from Germany and Singapore. Still about 20 people I have not answered yet. It's so impressive. So many people joined us. We're very happy. Okay, 26. I'm not sure if everyone participated, but I will continue. Next question. And we'd like to pick you, you to pick the choice that best describes you. Okay, so 32 people answered. I think that we will continue with the next question. And we'd like to know which two otter species are your favorite. Hey, thank you for telling us a bit about yourself. And that leaves me to introduce our speaker for today, Siva from Singapore. We're very happy to have him here today with us. Siva is the Southeast Asian coordinator of the IUCN Otter Specialist Group. He is further senior lecturer at the National University of Singapore and the co-chair of the Otter Working Group in Singapore. Siva is also known as the Otter Man and has been immersed in research in Southeast Asia since the late 1980s. In Singapore, he also promotes youth development, stewardship, public education, and environmental stewardship. He contributes to several wildlife conservation working groups and ground-up partnerships. He also actively participates in closed-door engagements to mitigate developmental impact to ecosystems. And the title of Siva's talk today is Otter Joy from Around the World and How It Reached Singapore, a Conservation Journey. Siva, I'll mute myself and stop screen sharing and I'll pass on to you.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thanks to and congratulations to the Otter Youth Circle. It's great to see that you got this started. I received a summons from them that I have to turn up and share some stories. So I've pulled out old. Well, it's a talk I give, and I keep having to edit it because we keep finding out new things about otters in Singapore. So first, let me give you something about my background. Pat Foster Turley was a chair of the Otter Specialist Group back in the 90s, and she had finished her PhD work, and she had a box full of crab parts. And this was from the sprains of the small-clawed otter in Malaysia. So she turned up in Singapore to talk to the director of the museum, who is a crab expert, Peter Ng. He's just recently retired, and he still remains active in crab taxonomy. And I had just finished my first degree, my basic degree, and he said, well, Pat Foster Turley says the Otter Specialist Group needs help in Asia. So do you want to go and chase a furry mammal in the mangrove? And I had started spending a lot of time in mangroves as an undergrad, and I foolishly said yes, because I had two conversations on graduation. One was about chasing otters. The other one was to give me a real job. But I decided to go for otters. And I went out to the field, and this was in Malaysia and Indonesia. And, I saw all these distant images, and I was, holy cow, what animal is that? In fact, there was once I tracked footprints of wild animal, and I finally rounded the corner and I saw a shivering dog. The poor dog had wondered who was following it so closely. It was a free roaming dog, and I tracked a dog instead of an otter. So you can see I was completely inexperienced. And then when I looked up the literature, there were all these synonymies, and there were 16 pages of Latin names that actually were just referring to a few species. So I actually went and dived into the museum. Now in Singapore, Raffles Library and Museum was set up in the 19th century, and the university had inherited both the books and the specimens. And in fact, now it's located in a very nice building within the campus. And I dug through specimens and books. So these books, right, Fauna of British India, actually had very important notes. And at the time when I was searching for it, the hairy-nosed otter, some people even thought it didn't really exist. It was a fiction of our imagination. So the old literature was very helpful in working out the diagnostics. I also wrote, in those days, writing is not sending an email. I wrote a letter to various people, and Nicole, who you might hear in a future webinar, sent me a box file full of literature, and this was literature that was not easily obtainable by the library, so that was wonderful. And after all that time, I realized, okay, it's actually 4 species, right? And when you look at the museum specimens, you can see that the hairy-nosed otter is a hairy-nosed otter, right? And there were these shapes which had a lot of variety, but Lutra had this wonderful W shape, which was so interesting to see. Lutra, which is the Eurasian otter, was at one point thought never to even exist in Borneo, but in a drawer in the Sarawak Museum, it was present, right? So there I was working out all of these dimensions, and it was so lovely to see that, oh, okay, indeed, the short-clawed otter had, just fingernail-like claws, right? And that of the smooth-coated otter was much stronger. So these are things that you can just look up on Google now, but in the early 90s when I started, this was all quite important to do. And I managed to summarize all of this so that I could begin my work. And the person who wrote to me, because he had been trying to figure out the same thing, was Hussein. So Hussein is now retired from the Wildlife Institute of India, but as a PhD student, he was also trying to unravel what he was seeing, going through all the taxonomic synonymies, and eventually figuring out what was present in his rivers in India. And he would do radio tracking of otters, and we would refer to his work. My students still refer to his work today, right? He's our red list expert. So, I could calm down. It's just 4 species. There were size overlaps, but the small-clawed otter was quite clearly the smallest. There were difference in the skull and the facial shapes. But when I asked friends for photos around the world when they travel, in European zoos and American zoos, every time it came back, it was small-clawed otter. So small-clawed otter, the husbandry of it is the best known of all the 13 species. And they are social, so there's quite a number of them. They must be attractive for zoos to keep. And so they were everywhere in the world. And then I heard through context that Zoo Negara in the capital of Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, they had actual living smooth-coated otters in a zoo. And so I went down and I sat there for 2 days, and I just took photograph after photograph of the 3 individuals that was there to build a search image in my mind, so that when I saw a distant brown head during fieldwork, I would be able to identify it. So the Otter Specialist Group put out this lovely desktop, and you can see that there are 4 species in there are 4 species in South America, and then there is 1 species in North America, right? And in Africa there are 3, and in Asia there are 4, one of which extends all the way to Europe. So when I was looking at the literature, there was very little from Asia. The very old accounts were useful, but in terms of the ecology, the biology, the home range, this was largely absent. So I drew heavily on the literature of Lutra Lutra. So the Europeans had published a lot of work. There were amazing people in Sweden who had mapped out the distribution of otters, and a lot of the time they weren't even seeing their animals. So they were trying to detect all of this from sprints, right? One of the previous chairs of the otter specialist group, they had an otter center, and they actually would release otters over suitable substrate that would leave footprints, so they could figure out from the distances between the prints what they would look like when the otter was running at different kind of speed. So the literature from Europe was there was overwhelming amounts, and tragically it seemed that otter populations were very small. They had undergone persecution in the past. So they were in a state where they're looking as to how to recover populations and to get landowners to coexist with otters, right? The other source of literature was actually the American river otter. And those projects were really big. They take helicopters to go and dart and radio tag their otters. And of course, there was a whole amount of literature on sea otters. But the sea otter is so different from the rest of the remaining otters that I would rely more on Lutra Lutra um, and the North American otter for understanding the basics of their biology, right? Of course, the sea otter is maybe the most popular species. So someone left me this, I don't even know who, on my table, and they always will put sea otter. So sea otters public relations is probably the strongest. And so we have 4 otters in Asia, right? And of these, right, the smooth-coated otter would turn out to be the most common in Singapore. It wasn't when I started my study, right? When I ended my study, I just said, well, we hope to see otters in the northwest of Singapore where there's some mangroves and there's a nature reserve. But they were only occasional visitors. The hairy-nosed otter, we now had good evidence for its presence. Our friends in Thailand had actually found a pub with some villagers, and the Malaysians had picked up a couple of roadkills. So we knew they were quite rare, but they were present. And later on, there will be more reports from Indochina. The Eurasian otter was doing well in that it was present, but we had no information from China, and we thought it had virtually disappeared. But we had our last otter symposium in China, and it is present in some areas where they had established nature reserves for pandas. And Max was amongst a group of Singaporeans who stayed up late at night in a Land Rover as the local guide finally brought them a photo. So its distribution is wider than we expected. And the small-clawed otter, which was so common in zoos around the world, interestingly, we are finding out that is getting less common than it used to be, right? So while the smooth-coated otter seems to persist in areas with some degree of urbanization, it's a big animal, it's a strong fish eater. The small-clawed otter is not doing as well. And you can find out more about information they were getting from around the world for various species if you just go to the Otter Specialist Group Bulletin. It's a really invaluable publication that publishes information about otters. So it's like a specialist publication, and we don't hesitate to publish any kind of news. So our colleagues around the world, as they find interesting things, are reporting it very quickly, and it gets published very quickly. So this is quite an important resource. In fact, I consulted the first few, I think the first 6 volumes at the time when I started out doing my work. Okay, so the story from Singapore, I thought I better remind you first where is Singapore. So it's in the western part of the Pacific. You recognize Japan and Philippines and Thailand, and right down this peninsula of Malaysia is Singapore. You can't even see it, right? It's so tiny. So at the bottom of Peninsula Malaysia is where you have Singapore, and it's actually just 50 kilometers by 23 kilometers in dimension, but it does have about almost 200 kilometers of shoreline. So it's a tiny place, and you must regard it as a petri dish. It's almost like an experimental site. And the good thing is, no nature reserve is very far away. If there's good habitats, then you can take a bus to go visit the place, right? But it's intensely crowded. So it's a city-state, but we still have fragments of habitats that we desperately are trying to ensure will survive our presence. So remember, I studied otters in the early 90s, and my last note on it was we hope it'll turn up. And about 4 years later, it did turn up, right? And it turned up thanks to Malaysia. So while Singapore had undergone dramatic changes, Malaysia still had a reasonable amount of natural habitats. And so it is a source of otters that came over in the northwest and the northeast, right? So they must have been doing well enough that they will be dispersing, right? And as they disperse, they found suitable habitats in Singapore. But they will come and visit and then they would disappear, right? So it was just transients that we saw. And I learned all about transients from the literature I consulted. So I knew that they were not residents, right? But finally, in the northwest was an area that was green. So you can see both in Singapore and Malaysia, right? So this is the Johor Straits, and this is Malaysia, and this is Singapore. And a lot of it is urbanized, but in this area, there are forests and wetlands on the Malaysian side, and Singapore had conserved this area in 1993, right? It was a very small area, but enough for the otters to cross over, right? So then when they came, the park staff were so excited and they were calling me because we saw pups, and that meant they were residents. So when pups are born, they can't even swim, right? It takes them a couple of weeks, then only they get shifted, and then only they begin to learn how to swim. So that meant that these were otters that were living in Singapore. But we wondered, would they stay in Sungai Buloh, which is quite a small space, right? So there was some good news in that rivers in Singapore, which were extremely polluted, would become clean. So this is my school where I was a student in the 70s and the 80s, and the water used to be, it was completely dead. It was black and nothing would live. In fact, when there were heavy storms, the farms upriver, you would sometimes see carcasses floating down the river. So it was terrible. But when Singapore became independent, they immediately set about to start cleaning up the rivers, and the waterways are now clean. So you can see we have a network of waterways, but this was set up not for nature, this was set up for drinking water, right? So as drinking water is obviously prioritized, then the transformation of these rivers was very fast. But if you look at a river like this, they're actually canals, right? So they don't have the form of a natural river, and we didn't even expect that wildlife would return, but it turns out they would. Now, we all know the otter is an amphibious animal, so just swimming in the water is not enough. They have to come up and dry their skin. In fact, I remember reading a report of Nichols back in the 70s or 80s, where she had visited zoos and had recommended that they provide an adequate amount of terrestrial space so that the otters can come on to land and dry themselves, right? So the good thing is, besides just cleaning out the waterways, there was a network of parks which were all linked. So this unknowingly was a wonderful setup for otters, an amphibious animal that will hunt in the water for fish and then come on to land and then dry themselves off, right? So, of course, the important question was, if these rivers had been transformed, was there anything living in them? And, there was plenty of fish which was not native, right? Because these are modified habitats, animals had been released for the longest time. Even the tilapia, a very large fish, right? That was released in the 40s, right, during the war by the Japanese. So it turns out, well, there was a dining table. It's a buffet table full of fish, right? The populations were good. And this is what fishermen were occasionally catching. So when the otters finally moved inland, they must have couldn't believe their luck, because this place was teeming with life. And unlike coastal waters, right, this fish didn't have very far to run. The waterways are confined, so they are not large water bodies which fish could disperse. And so actually, there was easy pickings. Now, otters, of course, leave sprints by the side of the water, and this would provide, of course, a lot of information which all those international studies had engaged in. So my first student, Meryl, she was quite a determined individual. So she sifted through the sprints, and we were able to report on what the otters were eating. So you can see that they were mainly eating cichlids. There were a lot of mullets, and actually a surprising number of prawns. So these were quite big prawns, and these were in natural areas, so in Sungai Buloh, right? But when you go and look at the waterways, then the composition changed. So we get the composition being largely cichlids, and that's because of all these exotic species that were present. So there's plenty of food to eat. Different from the coastal mangrove areas, the waterways were still chock full. But we know that otters need more than just food. And yes, there was plenty of space to dry up. So these are otters drying up, and I'm actually recording this footage with my handphone. So they're quite close. They're quite indifferent to my presence, and I must tell you, even until today, it just blows my mind. Because when I was following otters for my work in Malaysia and Indonesia, I would follow them at night. They wouldn't come out in the day, right? So in fact, around the world, we all thought, well, otters are nocturnal animals. Actually, it's just that with the persecution of man, they had shifted into the nighttime to hunt unmolested, right? So all of my experience with otters was following them on foot at night. Hussein was able to follow them in the day, but he was working in very remote areas, right? And then we realized that not all substrate is the same. They love some areas more than others. And NParks, which manages trees in Singapore, mulch a lot of trees. So they add all this soil. And the otters just loved it. And Jeff Tan, one of our local otter watchers, recorded this. And this went viral. And millions have seen this. Now, it's not just enough to be able to dry yourself. The otters need to be able to retreat into a space which they can defend themselves in, right? So a hole normally requires a narrowing of space. I wouldn't completely understand this until I saw two families in conflict. So the one family was chasing this smaller group. They retreated into the hole, and the bigger family wasn't able to go in deep, because as the space narrows, you're facing a lot of teeth, right? So smaller group is able to defend itself from a larger group because of the way they had picked the hole, right? Narrowing into a safe space. And so they were using urban structures under bridges, and you can see the kind of gaps that they were occupying. So it turns out the smooth-coated otter had food. It had that green space to dry off in. And then they had all these narrow gaps which they could retreat into to have a defendable hole. And then they completely confused me because we used to study like the nature of the holes and the timing of their emergence. But here were otters just resting in the open, right, in front of people in the day. So, I mean, where were they when I was doing my graduate work? It was so tough. I'd walk at night with my torch off. I became really good at moving in the dark, and I would stay upwind. And then here they were just flopping down on their bellies in front of me. So the bolder families were doing it. Some families were shy, right? So it became very important to provide guidance for people in a city who actually had been devoid of wildlife interaction, right? Some people don't even keep pets, right? So they just have no reference. And so we had to come up with information and guidance to tell them to keep a distance. It got a bit worse because of handphones. So everyone wants their photo, and the handphone zoom isn't really strong. So they will tend to walk towards adults. In fact, they'll even walk towards pups because pups are especially cute. And this created other kinds of problems that I'll talk about later. Yeah, so this is on the bank of the Singapore River, and the family is just sitting there, right? So people love this whole phenomenon. It was completely positive. And there was an active group of mainly photographers is how they started out, and they will come out to photograph otters, and they are able to photograph at all times of the day. And they begin to step up and help to educate people about maintaining a distance. So here you can see a family with pups, right, crossing a pathway which is just next to a river, and the public are holding themselves back in order to let the otters pass. So that was really good. And we had about 50 otters by that time. And it was quite the phenomenon. Now, in many of these spaces, the natural setting, right, of the river, and then the riverbank, and then the pathways where people would come to see them, it naturally formed a barrier to proximity. So people couldn't get so close to the otter. They would naturally tend to stand distance away. So that was a very nice setup. And the otters won't come so much onto land. And this was in the early days, right? So everything was good. All was at peace with otters in Singapore. And it's still the best place in the world to come and see otters. It's incredible, right? So we had to coin a phrase that we would advise people with. So although the otters came back to Singapore in 1998, they only reached the south of Singapore near the Central Business District 16 years later. So for more than a decade, although otters were on our coast, only people who went to the coast would be aware of their presence. A lot of other people just didn't know. But when he came to the Central Business District, the Marina Bay, then the secret was out. A minister wrote a Facebook post. Everyone knew where otters were. But before the minister wrote the post, he consulted with the agency, who consulted with the working group, and we said, please include this phrase, watch from a distance. And that's become like the mantra we use for any wildlife in Singapore. And it's quite important because people are not used to even dealing with free roaming dogs. They haven't really seen it, so they need a simple code, right? And of course, then people ask, well, how many otters are there, right? And where are they? So then this first distribution study was done by Merrill, She's now working in Australia. She's got a PhD, and this was when she was starting out as an undergrad. And as we collated all the reports, so this was reports by people made either to a web page that we set up or on Facebook or any other kind of communication, we managed to pin it down and get an idea of how the population had spread and where were the areas with the largest number of otters. And you can see sometimes the circles are very small, and those would be transient individuals. So they end up not staying, not raising a family, but we had understood this concept of transient animals from studies elsewhere, right? And you can see it's still not reached this area, which is the central business district and the main like tourist area of Singapore. They would do so in 2014. And then they will go upriver, and there will be a nature park, which is very famous because it has naturalized riverbanks. So that was just distribution, right? And when we wanted to do a census, then a young, energetic man turned up. And so this is Max, one of your hosts for today. And because Max is a very motivated individual, he said, I want to see every otter, right? So he actually saw every otter. And he did have the help of some otter watchers, of course. And he managed to come up with a number. Now, 79 doesn't sound like many individuals, but we were very cautious about how we release that information. We gradually released the information about otters. So previously, they knew there were 50. Later on, we did tell them there were 70. And when Mac's study finally was published in the Otter Specialist Bulletin, we then would tell them in 2018 that, okay, our verified count was now 79. Then another census was done. This was by another student, Anusha. She was actually studying in University of British Columbia in Canada, but she ended up returning to Singapore for exchange and was stuck here for 1.5 years. So she did her honors and she did a population census together with the help of the Otter Watchers. And now we had a verified number of 170 at 2021. Now, people see these numbers, but then when they look on Facebook, they see all these close-up shots of otters, right? And then they think it's really easy to see. So when they go out to look for otters, it can be difficult. The otters move around, right? So right now we are planning our third census. I think my student Michelle is in the audience. And we're trying to figure out a method that would involve active participation of the community, but additionally and using an open call, right? So the citizen science component is increasing because we may need to do census more frequently. And there's a reason for that, which I'll explain later. So we do release this sort of maps where these are the most likely places for you to see otters, but it still requires a bit of footwork, right? Now, so far I've been talking about in Singapore, it concerns the smooth-coated otter. There is a second species, but it's not common in Singapore. We think it's in the islands, which are in the northeast, but the number of sightings are not frequent, right? So we have to keep an eye on this because in Malaysia, the smooth-coated otter is also appearing in areas which have restored greenery and waterways, but we're not seeing the Asian small clod able to use these large waterways. So I think they are a species that will require greater concern and help. Okay, so the otters are amongst us. They are right at our doorstep. What can we learn? Well, the first thing is nocturnal or diurnal. And it was wonderful because they'll get up in the morning. So you at 7 a.m. you go and you wait for them. And then they go for breakfast. And then they'll have a hearty meal. And then they go to rest. And then you can go for your breakfast at about 9 a.m. It was quite a simple setup initially, right? And we could even watch them hunting, and often you can see this coordinated approach they use, right, when they chase after fish. And there'll be a lot of vocalization as they do this. This was a pond in a park, and you can see how they're pushing the fish towards the edge of the pond. And are able to then, as they herd the fish into the shallow waters and the fish jumping around, and then they are able to make a good meal. This was a lovely photo by one of our otter watchers. And it was quite interesting because they'll eat cichlids head first. So if you eat fish, you'll know we'll definitely not go for the head. But the otter, with its carnassial teeth, right, the opposing molars, which are very sharp, and they act like scissors, they can just slice through the top, right? So we would watch them bring the fish to the shallows and then slice through the head, but they would never do that with a catfish. The head of a catfish is really tough, so they will feed on it tail down. I don't know what it's like for the fish, but I think I'd rather be eaten head first. And there was another student, Tina, and when she appeared, she wasn't as resilient as Meryl. So when she was sorting through sprains, she looked as if she was going to have a nervous breakdown. So we said, okay, let's try a different method. Since we can actually see the fish, let's just get photographs. So she got photographs, and she could identify quite a bit of it. The relative size was possible to identify. There's a fish curator who was able to help us with individuals we couldn't identify. And then she was able to get estimate of the optimal size that they like to feed on. And you can see that they like fish that's 15 to 19 cm long. But it doesn't mean they would not take on a large fish. So here you have individual that was at least 55 cm long. And how big do otter families get? I'd heard of reports from Malaysia of pretty large groups, but by and large, I'll get reports of like 4. So Hussein's work, the family groups were very small, but we were getting quite large groups. And this was when one litter grew to maturity, they were not leaving. So the second litter comes along and the third litter comes along. And as we tracked all these numbers, you would see the Bishan family hit 16 by 2017, and that's not the largest. There was Bishan family with 26 individuals in 2022. Now, interestingly, right now, as we do the census, these large groups are beginning to fission. They are breaking up into much smaller groups, and they're actually harder to do a count of. So it could be that the fish abundance is not able to support these large families, and so they're beginning to splinter because we now have almost 200 otters, and the waterway is not able to support these large families anymore. So then, of course, with many families, can they coexist? So they are supposed to be territorial carnivores. And indeed, they would begin to have showdown. So this was in 2018, and you can see there's 5 individuals. We call them Bishan 5, and they were up against another group, Marina 6. And nobody knew about these battles. They just saw otters in a school. So this is my old school. And this was actually Bishan 5 on a hunt for their rivals, right? So they were fighting with another group called Marina 6. So this would be the battleground, the central watershed. And you can see it's a place where a lot of tourists go. So when I'm down there, sometimes I see tourists sitting by the side and like, do you know what an otter is? And they're like, otter? And like, come. And it'll just be in the river next to them. It's only during these fights when they're very noisy. And you can see that they adopt a formation. There's a lot of vocalization, and they head for the opponent. So here, some individuals from the other family that were slow were within their view. And what happens is a battle with a lot of bites. Now, this is when Bishan was 16 individuals, and you can see they are spread across 2 rivers. This is the normal home range. But when they are raising pups, they all retreat into a smaller area with the mom. So they don't abandon the mom, they hang out with the mom. right? And they are actually in a very small space for feeding. And there is definitely a compromise to how much they're able to feed as they stay with the mom. So we call this the natal territorial reduction, and we see this happen every time. Now, in the meantime, so here, this Singapore River stretch is unoccupied, and another family may move in. So in this case, another family uses the vacated space. It was Zook 6, right? But when the pups are old enough and get their swimming lessons, they are then brought out for a swim and they will recover the home range, and the other family will have to run away, right? Now, tragically, during these fights, right, it's usually a pup that gets killed. So here was the carcass of a pup that was retrieved and was sent to the museum. And you can see that it had suffered multiple bites, right? Now, of course, with a lot of otters in a city area, which is beginning to see nature return, there's going to be some problems. But I didn't expect this, but a lot of people keep fish ponds. It's quite the thing. And it started like way back in the 70s. So, oh, sorry. Before I go to fish ponds, the first problem urban adapted wildlife faced was roadkill. So here you can see a dad was returning to the family, and traffic could have killed it. And there are many instances in which otters do get killed. And in Singapore, when we have a city in nature, it's something that all wildlife face. So we actually have a roadkill working group trying to come up with solutions as best as we can. But this is an inevitability in a city, because if a population does well and the individuals disperse, then this is going to be a difficult situation for nature lovers to see. So we form a working group, we work together, and you can see there are various agencies and universities inside of it. And very interestingly, we have a otter watching community, and they will hunker down and wait for pups to emerge when they have detected that the female is pregnant, and she returns to a hole, and they will camp out until the time when the pups emerge, right? So actually, they are better than tracking satellite tracking data, and it's non-intrusive, and we have eyes on the ground, right? Now, with eyes on the ground, we then pick up when an animal is in distress. So members of public reported that this animal had a wire cutting through her body, and it looked like it was a very deep cut. So then we got organized to go and rescue the otter, and you can see that people come from various entities, right? There's the government parks, and then there is the zoo individuals. They are otter watchers. So enclosure was set up to rescue and dart the otter and then release it. Now, this, of course, gives us many, many challenges. And so we came up with a decision tree. But having a decision tree doesn't end it. We have to do consultation with every case that we decide on. So sometimes it's very difficult, because you see an abandoned pup. The family has decided not to accept it. There might be a situation where you try to rescue the pup and present it to the family again, and then back off, and they ignore it. So sometimes animals can pick up congenital problems and abandon pups, and it's not going to be able to survive. Then if it's out there, is it going to be left to a painful death? So crows were beginning to attack the pup. In this case, and then we can't keep it. It's a social animal that we can't keep. And there's no facility to keep. So then individual like this would have to be put down. So there's a difference in how you do management. In the wild, this would happen with no one knowing, right? And it goes on all the time for all species. In the zoo, of course, there's much more focused care. And in urban environment, we're having to strike a balance between these two situations. So yes, otters eat fish. It's not really news unless the fish is very expensive. Then it's, of course, exciting news. for the media to report on. And you can see this poor dog was had his photo featured because he didn't defend his fish from the otters. But interestingly, some of these fish owners said, no, we got to figure out how to coexist, right? Even though more than 100 fish were lost, they said these were just wild animals engaging in wild things. Of course, they are very irate homeowners, and Otter Working Group will reach out to them. So Reka, one of your other co-hosts, has run the gauntlet of trying to explain to people why this is happening, right? So during COVID, maybe because everyone was home, there was a lot of reports of human otter conflict, right? But we realized a lot of it was just sightings. Discontent was present, but discontent doesn't have to be a large number to give all of us a headache, because it can be people who are not yet used to the fact that wildlife in our midst. So we did studies, right? So this was a study of behavioral patterns of otters around the Singapore River at places where they would get up. And some of these were even next to hotels. And Rachel managed to clock more than 3,000 interactions. And you can see there was no evidence of aggression. So we were quite glad because in 2022, it looked like that this proximity wasn't going to become a problem, right? Because proximity was increasing as they were dispersing away. And you can see a defensive formation that these otters engage in. They see the dog. So you can see how they will coordinate, right, as a social group. And they're just curious at this point. It's not even aggression. The next is otter that approached an individual, but he just shouted and he backed off. And just by making a move to the otter, it backed off. So we thought, okay, everything is fine. But then parents will defend the young. So in the first 2 months, all of this data is invalidated when you have pups. Now watch this because the individual who's at the edge of the water had ignored the advice of the otter watchers to keep a distance. And this was a family with pups. Okay, so it's interesting because, well, first of all, he's quite athletic, so he can dance his way out of trouble. Not everyone could. The second thing is, as the otters came out, so he was on the ground and they were moving, and they moved forward to chase him off. But look how they are turning back. So there's a short distance around which they're defensive, and then they won't pursue you, right? So we had to figure out, there's another decision tree about what to do, how to go in and give advice. In some instances, how to even close up a hole after the otters have left, if it is an area too close to people. So right now, as we try and map otter populations, they're breaking up. So this is just for one sector in Singapore, in the southwest. And you can see there are various families, right? So my student Colin had, we worked this out in May, but within the next few months, look at the amount of movement. So I told you these large families are now fissioning, and the population dynamics is in a much more fluid situation. So Michelle is going to have quite a bit of difficulty figuring things out. And another student, Genevieve, finished this study last year, and you can see there were 4 resident families in these 2 rivers, and one subordinate family, after a couple of fights, ended up going into a residential area and digging a hole right under the pedestrian walkway. And this was the main walkway that people used. And when the parents had pups, they came out and they bit someone, right? Well, luckily it turned out to be my primary school mate, and he just went and got himself attended. It didn't make a fuss, but we were forced to relocate this family. And Singapore is crowded. There isn't many places to relocate it to. And we have to work with the local member of parliament and various groups. So this actually went up and got us a municipal award, which is actually kind of indicative of the nature of otters being in a city. It can't just be the science people and the management people. We got to have to work with individuals and entities that work with residents as well, right? So this is moving way beyond science. And as a result, there are many WhatsApp chats. I'm just showing you examples of three, which are monitoring various groups. And one of them is for Singapore Botanic Gardens, where a man had fallen and got bitten. So this is a heavily visited park. So now there's monitoring for the otters when they turn up. You can see this is a visitor services officer. He's on it and he's following the group, right? And they're making sure that people are not too close. So you can see most of these people know what to do, right? Keep a distance and you get a wonderful sight to behold, right? But the VSO is on board. He's there and he will alert his other staff if he needs help to contain a situation. So they're doing a wonderful job. And then they said, could we get the otters to hold in a different location? So we've tried, putting something up very quickly. So it's not something that require a tender to go and build, just existing materials. They set something up and the otters have come close. So, and you can see here, the individual is sprinting, right? So we are feeling, okay, this is quite good. And then recently they shared this video. So they've come to an artificial hole after several months. And so we are hoping they would find this place attractive. And when they have pups and they need a home, they would be active in a more discreet position in the garden. So when the debate gets a bit hot in Singapore, twice the Prime Minister, he was our third Prime Minister, twice he had come up to reaffirm that we must coexist with wildlife. So all of us are actually kept quite busy trying to make sure that people get advice, that otters being monitored. If they go into a situation that requires intervention, we will be there. We try to have very little intrusion by excluding them from certain areas, but it's really tough work, right? But thankfully, majority of people are happy. We have a very active working group full of dedicated individuals, especially all those otter watchers that are monitoring them all the time. And it's very important we go out and give talks like this, interacting with people on the ground so that they learn how to reconnect with nature in a way that we hadn't for more than half a century. Now, because of all these interactions and advice and interventions that are required, the working groups came together to have a webpage called Our Wildlife Neighbors. And you can see that there are common palm civets and bats and long-tailed macaques, besides just otters. And so this is a very active community that needs to go and interact with people, ordinary citizens in Singapore. So you can see that a lot of these stories was derived from the work of students, right? Who've been working on otter projects and long-tail macaques and wild pigs over the years. So I told you Singapore is like a petri dish. And so it's a great opportunity for completely clueless students, just like I was, to go out there and to interact with wildlife and to figure out basic ecology. It's been a wonderful experience, and it's safe with otter watchers out there. They are the uncles and aunties helping to look after my students. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this story we gave you from Singapore.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was a really great talk. I think now's the time if you have any questions to pop them in the chat, and then we will start working through some. So the first one that we have is from Carrie Kearns, and they ask, do the otters in Singapore live in bachelor romps like the North American river otters?
So the short answer to that is no.
Okay. I don't know if maybe if Carrie has any more questions on that, they can add it to the chat. The next question is how can we, this is from James Wood Echo Glen, I think. How can we directly support this work, particularly in Southeast Asia? And they gave an example of perhaps financially.
Oh, okay. So you can look up organizations that do the work in Southeast Asia. And there's one group which is the International Otter Survival Fund, which has funded several projects in Southeast Asia. They're based in the UK. I met them at the Otter Symposium in 1993. Grace and Paul Yorkson and their son Ben, wonderful people who have a very strong track record. You can look into their projects.
Brilliant. And perhaps someone can add a link to that in the chat as well. We then have a question from Ona saying, is the Lutra Lutra social or solitary?
So the Lutra Lutra is typically solitary. You'll only see several individuals when mom is raising pups. So it's much more difficult to find them. The smooth-coated otter and the small-clawed otter, because they're social and are communicating, can often be heard before you even see them. Yeah, so Lutra Lutra solitary.
Brilliant, thank you. And then I think the same person had a question saying, could you list some of the most interesting books you found about Lutra Lutra?
Oh, okay. I'm having to think back to the 90s. Taka the Otter. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's quite distressing. Oh, it was a film that someone recorded in Europe and sent me a VHS tape. It's quite distressing because the otter is in landowner's property and they're seen as pests that eat fish. So they get hunted. Yeah, and that's how it evades the hunt. There were some other books by Gavin Maxwell, and he actually kept an otter. A lot of people liked the book. I didn't really like it because I was studying otters and I knew what their home range was, and it's definitely not suitable to be living with someone in a home. So I had that inhibiting my ability to enjoy that book. Yeah.
So I think we'll have just one or two more questions. So in your opinion, what is the importance of Singapore for otter conservation on a wider scale?
Well, because of the visibility and the proximity of otters, we should be studying it and then sharing the information through publishing or giving talks. And recently in Malaysia, when they had some human-otter conflict, the otter people in Malaysia said, come over, which I did. I do feel the responsibility that we need to share the information. Max and Reka collaborated on a IUCN publication that featured the coexistence of otters in cities because they're beginning to return to some cities. In the UK, you know, they are in every county. They are turning up in some semi-urban areas. Lutra Lutra has also turned up in Korea. It's in along most of the Han River. It's close to coming to Seoul. So the stories we have here, which are relatively easy to study compared to almost anywhere else, it's important to do the work and share it. So film crew have come. the BBC quite regularly, and NHK from Japan. And we do help them. I'll sit down and have a discussion. And then some of the Otter Watchers are hired as fixers. And then everyone's eager to help so that it comes out in documentary work. And now some people are coming to study it on very quick visits. And then I will just host them. They might not have a long time. So in like 2 days, the Otter Watchers will find out where to go. And then I will show them areas where we had issues and how we overcame them. So Singapore is really like a laboratory. And also, it's really good for therapy. When the International Otter Symposium was conducted in Singapore, we worked very hard to try and ensure delegates could see. They ended up finally seeing it. And the joy on their face was really special. Some of the otter workers have been working on otters for decades and have barely seen them. So yes, do come to Singapore, contact us, and we'll give you clues where to go see them.
Absolutely, this is making me want to come and visit. And then just one more question, and then we're going to have to stop with the questions. So the last one is from Senan, and they say, I would like to know if there are any conflicts between otters and fishermen in your area. If so, how do you manage this conflict?
So Nico had warned of this, that there could be conflict with fishermen. And then my friends in Korea, who work on marine trash, had also warned me that this could be a thing. Interestingly, in Singapore, there was one case where a cage, illegal cage, had been put in the reservoir. It had trapped an otter, and the otter had died. And so people are very angry, but the people who worked with us to try and figure out how to solve this and to get the agencies to respond faster was actually an internet forum of fishermen. And so they're called fishing kakis. And they said they have quite a lot of young followers. It's a great thing for young folk to go and do, to go and fish instead of doing several other less constructive things, perhaps. And they had some respect for nature, and they wanted to appreciate the situation. So they actually worked. Fishing kakis actually worked with Otter Watch, which was informal group, in order to promote better protection of otters from illegal cages. So there are individuals who might be upset when a family actually turns up in a fishing spot, but so far that hasn't reached the kind of problems that have been recorded elsewhere.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you. And on that note, I think we will end the questions there, and I will pass back over to Simon.
Thanks, Siva, for this very cool presentation. We're at the end of our first webinar. On a short note, I just want to inform you that if you want to learn more about the Otter Youth Circle, you may visit the Otter Specialist Group webpage, and there's also a contact address if you want to get in touch with us. And now I'd like to encourage everyone to switch on their video because we'd like to take a group photo. And Siva, would you mind ending the screen sharing? Yay, more people coming. That's great. Okay. So many people. And there's another.
Hi, everyone. I see Anna too.
Yes, hi, Anna. Okay. I guess we are done. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and we hope to see you during our next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.